You didn't steal the mango?
I didn't steal the mango.
But you got beaten for it?
But I got beaten. Everybody got beaten for it.
Okay.
My friends would say, well, better we did thief the mango. Because at least if we thief the mango, then we know what I get beaten for. And then I realized that sometimes when we have a speedy justice system whereby we're just quick to mete out punishment to everybody, we create an environment in which it is easier for persons to pick crime.
Who is John Clarke?
Yeah, so John Clarke is a citizen of Jamaica, a lawyer who seriously, just like every other citizen, wants to see a better and more just Jamaica, and who try to play a role every day in trying to ensure that somehow we have justice in our country.
What drives you to this quest for justice for the ordinary citizen in Jamaica?
Well, for starters, my upbringing, because I recall when I was very young, I was an orphan, so I grew up in a children's home. So there was many ordinary Jamaicans who would play a role essentially in ensuring my survival, even at that stage. And in fact, I recall being told at a very tender age that I was found in the garbage bin, and that it was a old lady who found me and then handed me over to the police, to the state, and I was there, therefore in a children's home. Now, as a ward of the state, there were many little incidents that you'd have, and essentially you would be told that you don't have certain rights and you're not entitled to certain things because essentially society was taking care of it, so we should be grateful to be alive. So on that basis, that caused me a lot of trouble because, for example, somebody would steal something in the home and you would know that it's thumbed with, but nobody wants to say it's thumbed because you're afraid to get beat up. But then the system would develop a rule whereby rather than finding a way to find out who really did it, they would punish the entire dorm. So from that age I was saying, no, there needs to be a better way, a better justice. So I always formed the view that, I formed the view when I was younger that the court was the way that you'll get justice. So as a child I would say, well, if somebody does something you don't like, I'm going to sue you. And because I thought that the court was this fountain of justice where you'd easily get a remedy, and that would be the way you would remedy all the injustices in the world. But then I remember as I get older that you started to realize that there was that big thing about access to justice, whereas certain classes of people would find it difficult to, one, even sue to get into court, or to afford the very, what many people call very expensive legal fees. So because of that, one of the things that troubled me was that there are many vulnerable Jamaicans, and I myself would classify myself as a vulnerable Jamaican whose access to justice is dependent on where you fall on the spectrum. And it was something that always troubled me as a child and troubled me even now today, because anytime I see somebody be taking advantage of the system, I say, well, that could perhaps be me. If somebody perhaps didn't find me in a garbage bin and rescue me at that stage, perhaps if I wasn't adopted by a businesswoman and her family would have given me a certain lifestyle that I wouldn't have been encouraged to. So when I see a young man in prison and wrongly imprisoned, I say that perhaps could be me. And then when I started at Jamaicans for Justice, for example, and then I started being exposed to the different life stories of Jamaican citizens who were being killed by the police and the families trying to find a way to justice, and how the state was able to, by beautiful media access, paint the families as criminals and unworthy of justice, and how the society itself would be quick to shun persons and say, well, I lie them, I tell them I defend them criminal father. So because of that, I developed an interest in hearing the other side of the story and to see how best we can achieve what we call justice in this country.
How old were you when you were in the home and when you were thinking about these incidents of injustice?
I was very, very young because ultimately as a child, I had incidents whereby you start to wonder if you were even worthy of being treated a certain way, because essentially you're black, but they deserve certain treatment. So because of that, one would wonder what is right, what is fair, what is just. And I can recall even at 7, for example, I was beaten for stealing a mango that I never even steal. That I would say that this is not right, this is not
You didn't
just.
steal a mango?
I didn't steal a mango.
But you got beaten
But I
for
got
it?
beat. Everybody got beaten for it.
Okay.
But then I just start wondering if that is how a just society operates. Because one of the key things that occurred to me at that age is a viewpoint that when my friends would say, well, better we did thief the mango. Because at least if we thief the mango, then we know what I get beaten for. And then I realized that sometimes when we have a speedy justice system whereby we're just quick to mete out punishment to everybody, we create an environment in which it is easier for persons to pick crime. Because all of us as children learned that better we thief the mango. And in any event, what it turned out was an environment whereby if certain things weren't being seen at a smaller pace or slow pace, what was happening is that everybody learned that, well, if you sit on my teeth with some better give me peace, because when matron come and start beat me, you can say me to get my peace.
Okay.
So I know what I'm being beaten for. So you create an environment in which crime was allowed to foster. Because at the end of the day, we never learned at that stage an environment or an opportunity, even look at that children's home, but how it is we create an environment as to why the children wouldn't talk, and how it is that we can get the children to talk, and how do we create a more just system. And that's a problem that even though as we go back to the children's home, that we struggle with as a nation. Because if I spend a lot of time ensuring the police get the latest car, the latest tool, the greatest technology, but we haven't improved at the same pace our justice system with the same resources to ensure that when the police use these great tools, they have an efficient and speedy manner within which our criminals can be held to account.
How do you manage to maintain your high school face with so much legal work behind you, so many years at the bar?
I don't know what you're talking about because I'm seeing a lot of gray hair and stress. But everybody would like to hear that they're maintaining their high school face, but that's good. But what I've known is that this profession has exposed me to a lot of things that I would never have dreamt was taking place in this country, and that I hope that as a nation we will be able to address.
What are some of those things?
Well, for starters, I was shocked to see how easy it is, and many Jamaicans wouldn't appreciate it. But it's very easy for somebody to tell a lie on you, and for your entire life to be turned around, find yourself a criminal accused. And for example, I recall as a young man when I first started law, and then you'd see the police make a statement, they say there must be some ounce of truth to the statement, because there's a statement, if you don't go so, you go close to so. But in some cases, you don't even go anywhere close to so. And I only perhaps learned that belatedly while I was in law. For example, I myself, and in life, sometimes you don't appreciate things until it happens to you. So I had a scenario in which I was working at Jamaicans for Justice, and there was a sole witness who said that she was a witness to her police, to her father being killed. And she was the witness who needed to come to court to testify about the circumstances in which her father was killed. Now, she said she was free to come to court because each time she's come to court, by some miracle, there's some police vehicle checkpoint, the buses stop, and then she's searched, and either she can't make it to court or she feels threatened. So I take it upon myself that I'm going to try and assist her coming to court, because I was saying, probably the girl don't want to come, probably she's scared, whatever the reason, but I would assist her. And lo and behold, I was taking her from court to home in St. Thomas when my vehicle was stopped by the police, who took her out of the vehicle. And then when I protested at what was happening, I was told that it was some vehicle checkpoint. I was rude to the police, I boxed the police, and then that was released to the media to give the impression that I am this unruly attorney who was out to tarnish the police. And just by a snap of a finger, I was transformed from an attorney to a criminal defendant in relation to a matter which I was surprised I could even be charged for. So what you have was a scenario.
So you weren't charged?
I was charged, but surprised I could be charged. All it took for me to be charged was police officers just lying. And even though I protested and said it's a lie, ultimately people don't walk around with a video camera out on their cars to video everything that is happening. So what you realized was that simply the words of the police officer was sufficient to have you before the court. And in many cases, it opened my eye to realize that all it takes is for a malicious person to come and tell a lie on you, and that can be the only basis before which you're before the court, and in some cases the only basis for which you're convicted. The justice system is really at its core just a system that is developed by a human being to try and ferret out the truth. Sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong, because in the olden days not everybody who was burnt was guilty, and not everybody who was drowned was guilty, and today not everybody who is convicted by a jury will look at a person and say, oh, I believe this one, I don't believe that one is guilty. Because in some cases, a person might be on the jury box, might be a witness, and might be a very good liar, and can look you right in the eye and say, yes, I didn't do it, knowing fully well that he never do it. And that's life.
In this 2014 case, though, involving the young lady, the police reported that they asked you to produce your driver's license, and you didn't, and you became boisterous, and you hit a female police official.
Yes.
And you were charged for that.
Yes.
Was there any truth to your not being able to produce your driver's license?
For starters, yes, there was true that I could not produce a driver's license, but the driver's license was not requested, because if it was requested, the law at the time was they had 5 days to produce it. So if I was asked for the driver's license, I would inform them that I have 5 days to produce it, and that would have been okay, because I could have shown them the law, because at that time I always traveled with Road Traffic Act in my bag, and Road Traffic Act indicated I had 5 days to produce it. What took place was after I was in custody, they weren't aware, according to them, that I was a lawyer. Then when they found out I was a lawyer, they said, let us call it a day and quit out everything, because essentially they just wanted the young lady to come off. So when they found out that I was a lawyer and I'm not quitting off everything and I'm going to report them, then they say, okay, I have to write you up, and then they writing me up, they say, okay, we need the ID, we need this. It was only when I was at the station that the ID was requested. And furthermore, the officer who said I boxed her, right, indicated that she went to the doctor, but she couldn't tell the judge what was the name of the doctor, nor could she produce any medical for that so-called box. So essentially, a police can just create a story about you, and that's enough to have you in custody. And what is shocking is that after the matter was tried at court, the matter was determined in my favor. So the judge did not believe the police officers, but I reported the matter to Indicom. Indicom requested that actions be taken by the Commissioner of Police in relation to the officers. So I was looking forward to a date to appear at the police, to give my account to the police, to have some inquiry done by the police. And up to now, that has not taken place, because what I've grown to appreciate is that when citizens complain about certain things being done by the state, it's not every time that the state take it seriously or investigate these matters. So inevitably, what you have is impunity for police misconduct. As far as I'm aware, they are still in the JCF.
Whatever happened to the young lady who was the sole witness in the case?
Well, after the police again took her out of the vehicle, she indicated that it don't make no sense to bother with this matter. Her father already dead and gone, and she thinks that she's being harassed by the police, and that was the end of her seeking justice for her father. But I worked at Jamaica for Justice, and what I realized that her story was not unique. There were a number of families who suffer from the same thing. I would try and create a family support group where all the families could come together and share their stories and try and provide some comfort and solace to each other. And in fact, one of the family members would be the Maradine family, who are members of that group. And one of the things that is striking is that even 9 years after Maradine is dead, the police officers who were charged in relation to his matters, that their trial has not taken place. And it is a long road for justice for persons who have made allegations against the police.
You've been at the forefront of some significant court decisions in the court rulings in the last several years, and what one comes to mind is the unconstitutionality of the SOEs. And there is a feeling out there that you are on a course, you have a quest to bring down the government. So are you on a mission to bring down the government?
I'm not on a mission. I could care less who's in government, whether it is JLP or PMP. If any party decide or is pursuing a mandate which is likely to cause injustice to the ordinary Jamaican citizen, then that party, I believe, should seriously examine what it views as important. Every single prime minister take an oath, and every single minister, every single government official take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And if the government is doing something which is inconsistent with the Constitution, then that government ought properly to re-examine itself and ensure that the action that it takes is consistent with the Constitution. And it doesn't matter if today the JLP is in power and then they are doing something unconstitutional, or tomorrow the PMP is in power and they're doing something unconstitutional. What really strikes me and what really caused me the greatest concern is that the power makers, the power brokers, taking advantage of persons who can least afford it. And that is something that, regardless of who's in government, I would be seriously concerned about. Because ultimately, it is the people. If you go back to SOE, you have Jamaican citizens who were in custody for more than a year without charge, and the government thinking that that is permissible, that is correct, that is okay. And I fundamentally, regardless of whether it is PMP or JLP, believe that is, at its core is problematic. And we must never forget that for the SOE, it had bipartisan support. So you had the JLP MPs voting for it, and you had the PMP MPs voting for it, you had the JLP senators voting for it, and the PMP senators voting for it. So ultimately it was a question of law as to whether or not that particular issue was consistent with the Constitution and for the family members. Because at first I bought into the propaganda that, oh well, some strong action needs to be taken against these criminal elements, and one way to take that strong action is by means of ensuring that these persons can be detained until we can build a criminal case against them. And even though I'm a lawyer, and even though naturally we're all supposed to research and find out whether or not legally it is sound, one would assume that the government did that on our behalf, and that the government would not have taken an action which was inconsistent with the Constitution. So at first I was like, well, this isn't really a big issue per se. The government wouldn't have detained these persons unless they're criminals, so let that be that. But then when one started speaking with persons who were detained, and one found, for example, a client who was detained by his tenant. So he's a landlord, the police is his tenant, and then he was giving the police officer hell because the officer wasn't paying rent. And then the officer decided to detain him because apparently the landlord was a member of a goat stealing gang. And the goat stealing gang used a rope and stick, and that was their modus operandi. That's what the mode that they used to go out and commit their crime. And the crime they committed is that they would go to different people's yard and take up their goat, and that was the reason for his detention on the state of emergency. That man was detained for more than 14 days on the state of emergency. And when one look at that story, then one realized that there were avenues for abuse, because built into the system for state of emergency was an inefficient mechanism for reviewing the basis by which the tenant would come into his superior and say, I'm detaining my landlord for rent. Because he's not going to go into no superior and say, I'm detaining my landlord. He's going to come and say, I'm detaining Master Joe. Master Joe is a goat thief. So he detained him under state of emergency. The officers had as one of their key performance indicator the number of persons they can detain under state of emergency. So a lot of Jamaican citizens were being detained because officers needed to make it look to their superiors that they were working. And that is very concerning. And in fact, even though our politicians would say, oh well, crime is going down, persons are being detained, at what expense? If we were to say that we're going to stop corruption by detaining all of the politicians, I am sure that nobody in Garden House would agree with that, because nobody wants to be detained until it comes to your home where your liberty is being affected, and then it's not a problem.
SOE case, where is it going now? How far are you guys going to take it?
Well, the SOE case, the Court of Appeal handed down its decision in relation to which the government had appealed that decision to the Court of Appeal. Mm-hmm. So the next stage is for the government to make a decision on whether or not they carry the matter to the Privy Council. So it's in the government's ball as it relates to that. But one of the factors that I can appreciate is that many of the detainees would want the very system by which they were originally detained to be declared to be unconstitutional, because the government still believe that they can continue to do it, and perhaps that itself is an issue that is before the Supreme Court, and I expect will ultimately be decided by the highest court of the land, because based on the stance that the government has taken and how it has defended all of these matters, it is firm enough to view that citizens can be detained without a trial. And while that is particularly problematic for me, I just want to make it clear, same like how somebody could take a citizen in some hundreds of years ago and say, I'm going to put you in fire, and if you don't burn, that means that you are innocent, otherwise you're guilty. It's the same way persons nowadays can have lives stolen them, and the police officers say, I'm going to detain you on the state of emergency until we can see if there is enough evidence to charge you, so a judge can decide if you're really guilty. And that is problematic.
I'm hearing from you that injustice is really what drives you.
Yes.
All right. For the purpose of this interview, just tell us about some of the problems in the justice system.
One of the main issues that concern we have right now is the delay in relation to how appeals are heard in this country, because the criminal justice system has never received the same level of funding, that is, the courts have never received the same level of funding that the Ministry of National Security, the police, have received. So if you look at the budget for the two, they're miles apart. So now the police would essentially, we have always increased the budget for the police, and say the police need the latest tool, they need the latest equipment, they need a vast expansion of resources to fight crime. But yet the justice system has not always received the same resources. So as it relates to the poor, so we have, for starters, a man who has been convicted. Let me go back, even before conviction, even legally. We have a system by which if a man is charged for legal aid, the regular charge that the lawyer is paid for legal aid could very well be the same charge that a criminal, a person who's charged for a criminal offense would pay his lawyer for a single court appearance. So even for the trial itself, so let me give an example. Let us say legal aid is $200,000, which is not $200,000 for the entire trial. And the trial,
Irrespective of how long it takes.
Irrespective of how long it takes. Okay. What it means is that in some cases, you have some lawyers who charge $200,000 just to do a question and answer. So because of that, what happens invariably is that every lawyer who does legal aid is essentially doing a public service. And then in the event that you are charged and your matter involves a lot of work, and the lawyer knows I'm going to be getting one single fee, there is a perception that the amount of resources that that lawyer can attend to that public service may be less than he could attend to a paying client, because the lawyers are not paid properly in the first place to provide legal assistance to the poor criminal defendant. That's one. So now you're convicted, and in some cases I have visited the prison where clients would tell me that the lawyer who is defending me didn't get an opportunity to talk to me before I was tried. So therefore he defended me on what is on the paper, and I wasn't able to tell him X, Y, and Z. Well, that's what they would say. But
Okay.
But ultimately the point I'm making is that when the lawyer has to do real public service, it means that the lawyer, even if the lawyer were to go and speak to that prisoner in the prison, that lawyer is not going to be paid by the government for doing that. So the lawyer's anything the lawyer does for legal aid is really a public service. And we have to really examine that situation and to say whether or not it is just for legal aid to be paying the kind of sum that is being paid for lawyers to assist prisoners.
So
because ultimately there's some lawyers who just simply refuse to do legal aid, and there's some lawyers who refuse to do legal aid depending on the volume of work. So if you recall, for example, in the gang matter, they had to pass some special measures just to get some lawyers to do the matters, because a lot of lawyers were refusing to do the gang trial because they said they were going to take more than a month and they'll still be paid a flat fee, and that flat fee is not worth 1 day's work.
What if the case goes to appeal?
If it goes to appeal, it's a different money.
Okay.
But the issue is that...
But that case could take 5 years.
It could take 5 years. In some cases, it take even longer than 5 years. But what it also does is that it creates an unfair incentive for... and luckily in Jamaica, we don't have unscrupulous lawyers. But it creates a unfair incentive for unscrupulous lawyer, even a perception the lawyer would just want the accused to plead guilty, because the quicker the accused pleads guilty, the quicker the lawyer is paid. So if my client takes 5 years and fights the matter to the end, then I won't get paid until 5 years done. But if my client pleads guilty within 3 months, I'll be paid within 3 months.
Just as a matter of curiosity, how soon after a matter is completed that if you're doing this for legal aid, through legal aid, that the lawyers are paid?
Well, that's an entirely different story, because in some cases lawyers say even a year after, 3 months after, they're not paid. But why I've raised that point is because I'm saying that for the criminal defendant who doesn't have the resources to pay a lawyer, is already started at a disadvantage, because the system by which lawyers are paid, the lawyers themselves are doing a public service. That's one. Then secondly, why it is particularly concerning, going back to the appeals now, is that you can be convicted for whatever reason, and then now you want it to be reviewed by a superior court. But then that superior court is going to need a note of evidence or some ideas to what took place at the trial. And in some cases, we have done cases, for example, Brian, Russell, Ray Morgan, where the prisoner would essentially complete the sentence, as in figuratively, because in our law, will complete the sentence without the appeal being heard. And when I say complete the sentence, I don't mean that he really completed the sentence, but he would have completed the time that he would have served if he had not appealed. Because under our law, we have a mechanism pursuant to Section 31 of the Judicial Appellate Jurisdiction Act, or Appeal Act, which says that essentially you don't really start to serve time when you're appealing until the appeal is heard. So we have had a client, for example, Mr. Anderson, there's a public judgment, who would have completed the time that he would have served if he hadn't filed an appeal, and served extra days in prison, extra months in prison, waiting for the appeal to be heard. And even after he had completed that time, served the extra month, he had not started his time in prison until the Court of Appeal made a formal order saying that, okay, we have now heard your appeal. We're going to say that your appeal started more than 8 years ago. You're free to go, sir, because if you had not appealed, you'd have been home already. And what that does is create an environment whereby the persons who are found guilty learn very early that perhaps the best thing for you to do is not to challenge it, because if you challenge it, you're not serving any time until the appeal is heard. And the appeal could be heard years later. And for Omar Anderson, his appeal was heard after his sentence was complete.
Well, that speaks to another situation within the system about getting the transcripts.
It speaks to the situation about getting the transcript, and I know that the Chief Justice and the relevant authorities hopefully are implementing systems. They're implementing systems to correct that, and hopefully they will get the resources needed to ensure that what took place to these appellants don't take place to any other appellant. But moving forward, even beyond that, that section 31 that exists currently in our law, that say that you don't start serving your sentence until the appeal is heard, that section should be repealed, because it's a special invention just for criminal matters. Because in every other area of the law, when a judge makes an order, that order is extant, it continues until an appeal court says otherwise. So just be clear, if I sue you and the judge says I must pay you $10 million, right? I must pay the $10 million even if I appeal. So just by appealing, that doesn't mean that I don't owe any money. The court of appeal have to hear my appeal and then make a determination as to whether I owe you money. But now if I'm found guilty of stealing your $10 million and then I sign an appeal paper, by law my signature is magic. It stops the time from running and I don't start serving my sentence until the appeal is heard. And if my sentence for stealing your $10 million is 3 years in prison, plus pay back that $10 million, and my appeal is heard 15 years later, it would mean that my appeal would not have started until 15 years is expired. And that can't be just.
Yeah. If you had the opportunity to make proposal for at least one reform mechanism, is that where you would start?
No, if I had one proposal, I believe it would be a creation of a effective law reform commission, so that a legislation to deal with that.
We don't have one now.
Well, we have some. we don't have a law reform commission in which, for example, members of the judiciary are active commissioners of that commission. But what I do want is something similar to what exists in other jurisdictions, where we can properly research some of the systemic problems in our justice system and have persons who actually used to be judges, persons who are judges, persons who are lecturers, appointed as commissioners to play an active role in reforming our justice system. It can't be left alone to our politicians, and it can't be left alone to a law reform unit, which is under-resourced. It is full time that we bring our law reform process within the 21st century.
What would you do about the parole system?
Well, what we have done is that there's a case that we have filed in the Supreme Court by a prisoner who had challenged the constitutionality and the mechanism by which his parole decisions were made behind his back. So what I would want as relates to the parole system is for the government to examine, and it has to be done essentially, so the parole system, to examine the current system, to examine its conformity with the Constitution, how fair it is to prisoners, how fair it is to victims, is it sufficiently open, does members of the public have an opportunity to make representation to the parole decision makers, and are decision makers sufficiently insulated from political interference? And explain what I mean. There was a news report one time that a government minister was concerned by the number of persons who were getting parole, and that the parole board was suspended by the minister until he investigated the circumstances under which persons were getting parole. And then eventually you hear that a new parole board was appointed, and then parole was being processed again. But what we have invariably is that the court would say that persons can be subjected to get eligible for parole at certain times. So for example, Tom Stroke will be eligible for parole after serving 20 years. Now, eligible for parole means that he can apply for parole. But then Tom Stroke will be sitting in prison waiting for 20 years. 20 years pass, and he has to wait for 20 years to fully pass. And then in his 24th year, he has applied for parole, and he doesn't know the parole is heard. He doesn't have an opportunity to see all the papers against him. He doesn't have an opportunity to address any lies that may be told on him. He doesn't have an opportunity to see how the parole board made his decision. And then ultimately, sometimes he may be lucky he get through, other times he may not get through. But we're saying if you're having an effective justice system, it must also apply to the parole system. So one would love to see that the parole system is brought into conformity with newfound principles, and it is fair not only to the man who's applying, but to victims, because invariably we don't really have a victims charter to ensure that victim voices can be heard, like we have in other countries, in relation to whether or not Tom Stroke, who may have killed your mother, should be released, and why you think he should or shouldn't be released. But ultimately, if we're trying to create a more just system, we have to learn from the lessons of the past and ensure that these things don't happen again.
Given the frequency of how things happen within the system, again, the case of Mr. Williams.
George Williams.
Right, and I'm sure there are many more like Mr. Williams within the system. You think we're really serious about justice reform in Jamaica?
Let's start with George Williams. So George Williams was a prisoner who had spent almost 50 years in prison. He was never convicted of a crime, but he spent 50 years in prison. So whilst he was in prison for 50 years, he would have seen prisoners who were convicted of double murder serve their time for double murder and release whilst he's there waiting for his trial date. His case has given many persons in the judiciary system a moment of pause. And everybody say, oh, it's a sad case, this thing should not occur again, and everybody wants a more effective system. But even after we said that about George Williams and everybody expressed their outrage at it, whilst we're speaking to you now, there are persons in custody in Jamaica awaiting trial for more than 20 years. So we have not found an effective system to have the persons who are currently in custody removed. And one thing that I'm happy that George was able to say is that he wanted to challenge the system so that every other prisoner who is in custody for a mental illness, that they can be removed. Because one of the key questions he's asked in the court is whether or not it's correct for persons who have not been convicted of a crime and who have mental illness to be placed in prison with convicted prisoners. And he said that that is fundamentally wrong, because he had to adapt and interact with persons who were convicted prisoners and who would lick him in the chest and tell him to go hold it one mad boy. And that is the kind of country that we have. And that's why I say I look forward to the law reform commission, because a law reform commission would hope would examine a case like George Williams, make binding recommendations to the government, or however the government asks for that to be implemented, and those recommendations would be tabled in Parliament and the proper system implemented as it relates to how we're going to effect real change.
How important then is justice and justice reforms to the progress of a country like Jamaica?
Unfortunately, that is a question that I'm trying to answer every single day, because many of us answer justice in relation to our own personal experiences. And I say this because ultimately many Jamaicans will say that, for example, if my father is killed by Tom, right, I want the best justice that I can get, but I'm only going to see justice from my perspective. So I may not have seen Tom kill my father, but then I would hear my neighbor say Tom do it, and I'm convinced it's Tom do it, and I want Tom to be hanged from the highest fence because that is justice for my father. And ultimately, we all see justice through a different prism, and the court is one who will have to ultimately decide what justice is in many cases. But why I ask is who really want justice is an interesting question, is that many of us only want justice for ourselves, but not for the other man. So that means if Tom Stroke is dead, that is justice. But if Tom Stroke is to have a trial, he not deserve a trial. He killed my father, just kill him right now. He not deserve no food. So ultimately, the cries for justice, speedy trial, is a balancing interest, and that is one of the reasons why we see justice on a scale, because that will balance the cries of the victims as against the cries of the accused, and somehow hope that by our stares and looking at the accused, we can tell if he is wrongly accused or not. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. But that is our justice system.